There is unease among Western countries as African nations shift their partnerships towards non-Western actors, notably Russia. However, one Western nation has been particularly vocal, surpassing others in expressing concerns about Russia's presence in Africa. This country happens to be France, the former colonial ruler of over 14 African nations, and one word that aptly describes France's stance towards Russia's involvement is envy. France, led by President Emmanuel Macron, is frustrated by the fact that while its influence in the Sahel region has diminished, Russia has been warmly welcomed. President Macron envisioned himself as a leader who would restore France's greatness and guide Europe forward. To achieve this, maintaining control over its former African colonies seemed imperative. These colonies were instrumental in elevating France to its global power status. When President Macron assumed office in 2017, he made a speech claiming that France no longer pursued a specific African policy. This pronouncement was a strategic move to make Francophone Africa believe that France had changed its approach. However, despite his efforts to reshape France's policy towards Africa, since 2017, all attempts failed. By 2020, anti-French sentiments started spreading, leading to the first coup in Mali and the subsequent expulsion of French forces from the country. In 2022, another coup took place in Burkina Faso, resulting in Captain Traoré assuming power and French forces withdrawing. It was at this juncture that President Macron grasped the failure of his supposed new African policy. In February 2023, he embarked on a tour of 4 African countries, where he outlined a fresh strategy for Africa. During the tour, President Macron emphasized that France's approach towards Africa should prioritize humility rather than military presence. He announced plans to reduce France's military presence in Africa in the following months, shifting towards a different approach. In summary, France, under President Macron's leadership, has shown signs of envy regarding Russia's growing presence in Africa. The country's attempts to establish a new African policy have faltered, leading to a reevaluation of its strategy with an emphasis on humility and a reduction in military involvement on the continent. Despite President Macron's tour and speech outlining a new strategy for Africa, the recent coup in Niger dealt another blow to France's influence in the Sahel region. French forces were once again compelled to leave the country. This development adds to the string of losses suffered by France, including Mali and Burkina Faso, which have significantly diminished its presumed global power. The situation is particularly frustrating for President Macron, as his tenure has seen France lose its grip on its former colonies. This loss is an embarrassment for Macron, who presented himself as a leader different from his predecessors, offering a fresh approach to the French-Africa relationship. However, it became evident that Macron maintained the same condescending attitude towards Francophone Africa as his predecessors did. The African nations had grown weary of this neo-colonialism and consequently expelled France. Has France learned from its mistakes? The answer seems to be no. President Macron refuses to acknowledge that Africa's decision to remove them stemmed from fatigue with French neo-colonialism. Instead, he blames Russia for instigating the actions that led to France's expulsion. Macron claimed that anti-French sentiments were spread across the Sahel due to Russia disseminating false information about France. The question arises, what exactly is this alleged false information? Could it be the exploitation of Francophone Africa by French companies over the years? Or perhaps the French military's failure to address security challenges in the Sahel? President Macron went as far as accusing the Russian mercenary group Wagner of orchestrating the coups in the region. Astonishingly, Macron even asserted that certain African countries owe their existence to the presence of the French military. However, these claims seem unfounded when considering that the insecurity in the Sahel has escalated since the involvement of the French military. It becomes clear that France remains resistant to learning from its past actions. Consequently, African nations are embracing the vision of a multipolar world and seeking cooperation with nations like Russia, China, and other global South countries. This shift signifies a departure from France's dominance and an embracement of alternative international partnerships. France's discontent and envy towards Russia's growing influence in a changing global landscape have become increasingly apparent. President Macron, in an attempt to mask these sentiments, seeks to redefine his role as a defender of Europe and ally of Africa against perceived Russian aggression. Not only has President Macron accused Russia of destabilizing Africa and undermining democratic processes, but he has also called for Western troops to be deployed to Ukraine to combat Russia in the ongoing conflict. According to him, Europe's credibility hangs in the balance, but in reality, it is his credibility that he seeks to restore. With the loss of Africa as a stronghold, President Macron believes that defeating Russia is crucial for France to regain its global standing. This explains his call for troop deployments and his impassioned rhetoric, urging European leaders not to display cowardice and promising unwavering French support. However, President Macron seems to have overlooked the potential consequences of NATO intervention in Ukraine. Such actions may escalate tensions and potentially lead to a catastrophic World War III, as President Putin has made it clear that Russia is prepared for any intervention by the United States. President Macron's misguided approach is a source of shame, as he aims to compensate for the setbacks in Africa by risking the onset of a global conflict. Fortunately, other European leaders have distanced themselves from his statements, displaying greater prudence and foresight. In an interesting turn of events, Russian President Vladimir Putin finally responded to President Macron's recent outbursts. During a March 13 interview, President Putin made a notable observation about Macron's reaction towards Russia. According to Putin, Macron's vocal stance stems from his resentment over losing African allies to Russia. In President Putin's view, the French president's strong and emotional reaction is intrinsically linked to events unfolding in African countries. Putin further emphasized that France's issue with Russia does not solely revolve around Ukraine. The crux of the problem lies in Russia encroaching on France's interests in Africa. Putin also highlighted that leaders of certain African nations sought negotiations with Russian businessmen, displaying a preference to work with Russia rather than France. Contrary to France's perception, Russia cannot be held responsible for the situation they find themselves in. President Putin's statement regarding President Macron holds, in our view. Instead of reflecting on their failures in Africa, France has resorted to shifting blame onto Russia. The reality is that recent changes in Africa's geopolitical landscape are not influenced by Russia. These changes have been a long time in the making. Following the nominal granting of independence to African nations, France continued exploiting its former colonies in Francophone Africa. It exerted control over their currencies and enjoyed cheap access to their valuable natural resources. For instance, a significant portion of France's electricity is generated from uranium extracted at an unfairly low cost in Niger, a country where the majority of its people lack access to basic electricity services. This neocolonial system was sustained by France, which engaged in corrupt practices, bribing local regimes to serve its interests. In return, France provided continuous security through its military bases. This arrangement enabled African leaders like Omar Bongo of Gabon and Paul Biya of Cameroon to cling to power for extended periods. France's system ensured that any African leader who resisted its influence would face removal or assassination. However, the era of French dominance is now a thing of the past. African countries are discovering newfound independence, purpose, and solidarity. They are committed to supporting each other in resisting pressure from France, as they no longer wish to reinstate the previous status quo.